Alright guys, Scrappy again today. Hope you're all doing good and enjoying your day so far. After another disappointing defeat for OpTic Texas last night, Dashy has given his thoughts on exactly what specifically is holding OpTic back at the moment. The search and destroy play over the last couple of weeks in this Major 4 cycle has not been special at all, and even looking back to the Major that they won, they needed some bailout moments to get over the line. If they improve their search and destroy, will they be back in business, or does that only paint half of the picture in terms of why OpTic have now lost 4 series in a row for the first time in their CDL history? Very much on Twitter, your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always, I greatly appreciate it. Gotta say, ever since FormaL talked about potentially coming back to the COD team, well, the COD team hasn't been doing so well. We'll get onto that in a second. Before we get there, we've got to talk about this series because I gotta say, the way the league started this year, and even a couple of months ago, these online qualifiers were just some of the worst COD you could ever watch. Like, you knew who was going to win. It was so dull. The teams at the bottom of the league were just playing terrible COD most of the time. Maybe there was some entertainment to be found in 2 terrible teams battling it out. And when you had a top 4 game, sure, it was great. But really, the online qualifiers were dull and it was all about the Major. But over the last couple of weeks, really, just in Major 4 in general, the qualifiers so far, yes, there have been changes to the game, but I do think that a large part of it is the fact that, look, you've got Stage 4 Major coming up. It's an important tournament in terms of qualifying for the World Championship, and straight up will determine whether some of these guys keep their jobs or not effectively. If you don't qualify for champs, you're probably losing your job. And if you're on a team that's in the bottom 4, are you getting on another team next year, given that there's, you know, plenty of talented players, Slasher, really, etc., that are out of the league right now that probably will be back in next season? So it's a big fight at the moment, and it's absolute chaos. So Gorillas, they played Vegas Legion, the Vegas Legion Dynasty, as I've been calling it, right? Because they've been dominating everyone they've played. Not necessarily dominating, but they beat OpTic. They 3-0'd New York. They 3-2'd Surge. Yes, they got 3-0'd by Toronto at the start of the stage, but it was looking up for them, right? It was honestly looking like Vegas were hot favourites potentially to make it to the World Championship, but LAN will be key. Whether they can replicate their online stuff on LAN is a question, but Los Angeles Gorillas, we saw them demolish Boston the other day. And I think for good reason, many put it down to Boston just being atrocious, which they were. I think there's no getting away from that. But to be fair, in that series against Boston, there wasn't too much credit given, maybe understandably, to their, the team that beat them, right? Los Angeles Gorillas 3-0'd Boston in about 30 minutes. It wasn't even close. That was Boston being bad. But it's quite plausible that Gorillas have actually improved quite substantially. They win a 3-0 series here against Vegas last night. All the maps were close. Like, there were certainly moments where, Vegas will feel like they could have had the advantage and won, but eventually they take the search and destroy 6-4 after winning a close hardpoint, and then they close out a 3-2 on the high-rise control to such an extent here that we get Diamondcon, who, to be fair, has actually had a pretty big bounce-back stage for him, right? I think last stage, at the start of the season, Diamondcon was arguably their best player. Then as time progressed, he kind of fell off a little bit in the Major 3 cycle. Obviously, Assault was gone, Flames was in, but now he's started to turn it around again, and here he is, dropping the emote on the head of the Vegas Legion and Johnny, which is just hilarious, isn't it, really? Because Johnny obviously was dropping some emotes, and now they're getting emoted by the Los Angeles Gorillas after getting, monkeyed on, or whatever they say, after the Gorillas win a series. And, 3-0 slammed, right? I mean, have a look at this. Diamondcon with a 1.23, not the best series for Geo. And, look, it was a close fought affair on the 3 maps that were played, but all of those maps went in the way of Gorillas. So, this is an incredible result in many ways. I thought Vegas were going to handle business in the series. They didn't, and that leaves the championship standings like this. And, wow. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in the CDL history. This may be, in some respects, the final year of the CDL, at least in this current format that we presently have. I wouldn't be surprised if next year's a dramatically different format. But as it stands, we have 5 teams within 5 points, with a couple of weeks of matches left to play in the regular season. Like, it is kind of unbelievable, isn't it? FaZe are at 475. Toronto are now at 430. They've overtaken OpTic. That is important because OpTic look like they will now remain the 3rd seed, right? I mean, as it stands, they could obviously overtake Toronto. They could technically overtake FaZe, but I don't think that's going to be happening. So OpTic are going to be the 3rd seed, maybe the 2nd seed. And, of course, if you're the 3rd seed, that means in the World Championship Round 1, you play the 6th seed, which is currently Seattle Surge. If you're 2nd seed, you play the 7th seed, which is currently Los Angeles Thieves. So, there is some marginal advantage to be gained, being the top seed, of course, going into the World Championship, but FaZe will probably be that again. But Thieves are at 145, Ravens are at 140, Vegas are at 140, Rocket are at 140, and now Gorillas are at 140. Like, you could not make some of this stuff up. it's very interesting what that series result means for teams such as, let's say, Ravens, because on the one hand, you know, Vegas didn't get as many points as they could have done, but on the other hand, Los Angeles Guerrillas all of a sudden are back in the mix, because it seemed to me that they were kind of out of their way, really, Guerrillas. It's never over for them, but just because their online record is so bad this year, you know, their map count has been pretty poor in general, it didn't really seem like there was that much hope for Guerrillas. But now it's like if you're Ravens, there are still 2 spots to be fought for here, right? Because I think Miami and Surge are going to be fine. I think they're going to make it. So really there are 2 spots to be fighting for. And if you're a team like Carolina, for example, I know that, you know, probably of these teams they have some of those fans because of Clayster. People want him to qualify for the World Championship again. That result is kind of good and bad because it keeps them in 8th place at 140, but it also means Guerrillas are now potentially a threat to make champs themselves. But, you know, I think that's probably in general best for the teams above them that Vegas didn't get to 150, because if Vegas got to 150 on a 4-series win streak, you know, they're looking really good. And they're still looking good to make winners bracket at the upcoming major, right, as we'll see in a couple of minutes' time. A couple of stats that I thought were kind of interesting. Scrappy continues to play with insane consistency. Neither Scrappy nor Cellium have dropped less than a 0.9. So of every series they've played, they've had in the negatives. But if they're ever negative, they're 0.91, 0.92 at a bare minimum, right? They never go below that, which is kind of absurd. And that's 32 out of 37 now a couple of days ago where Scrappy had gone positive. But this is some of the reaction to the OpTic series, right? Because we talked about it last night. There are a few plays in crucial moments, but especially the search and destroy that have been catching the attention, right? Because they're, what, 2-7 in search and destroy so far this stage. They won one against Miami at the start, but that was with Purge, of course. And it was probably the key factor to their win in Toronto, right? FaZe were incredibly good at respawn that event, but FaZe were like, what, 1 in 5 in search that tournament? You know, they lost a couple when it mattered to OpTic and Toronto teams such as this. So, you know, OpTic Kenny and the OpTic guys in general, their search and destroy was a big factor why they won that event, certainly why they were able to beat FaZe in the manner that they did. Now, historically, Kenny, certainly online, has not been the greatest search and destroy player. You're not necessarily expecting him to be, but I know that it was a key talking point for Kenny earlier in the season. I think probably during the Major 2 cycle, where he was making the point that, yeah, he needs to step up his search and destroy gameplay or they're going to struggle. I think he did. But now, in some ways, they're kind of back to square one. And Kenny says, like, speechless, GG's New York, what to even say about that? And the problem is for OpTic that, sure, you know, maybe they're going to bounce back nicely on LAN, and I think they'll play better on LAN, but they could be starting LAN from the losers bracket. Like, genuinely, that seems almost more likely than not at this point. It probably is more likely than not that they're going to be starting in the losers bracket at Burbank, and as Dashy says, gotta close out these search and destroy. So that is the key point for them, right? The game 2 was pretty bad. The game 5, there were plenty of moments they could have done a better job in, and yeah, few communication things, few team call things. New York have been good in those search and destroys generally, but the OpTic record in search this stage, you simply cannot get away with it, right? I mean, this is their search and destroy performance so far this stage. They're 2-7. They're on a 7 search and destroy map losing streak, which, you know, like, they're not going to break Boston's record. But Boston's record that they set this season is like 14 search and destroy losses in a row, which is just tragic. And OpTic are like halfway there, which is wild, genuinely wild to think about, right? That the Major 3 champions are on a 7 search and destroy losing streak against, like, not even great teams. It's not like they've played FaZe, Toronto, New York back to back to back. Like, they lost to Vegas, they lost to Rocker, they lost to Ravens. Like, those were the 3 series they lost in a row. 0.92 Team KD, 4.11 round wins, which is, you know, when you need 6 to win, that's pretty bad. 0-4 in game 5s, 0-3 on Karachi, 1-3 in round 11s. And the real bad numbers here from the player side is on Pred, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. This stage, he has a 0.76 in search and destroy, 0.6 kills per round. Okay, he has some first bloods, but, you know, Pred's performance, and honestly, when you watch, there's been a few moments this stage, even last night, certainly when they played Vegas, where Pred will just throw his life away, right? And maybe it's the fact that they're not taking online COD so seriously, but it's like, you know, you've got to play how you're gonna, you got to practice how you're gonna play, right? And if you consider online qualifiers to be practice, which for the top teams they kind of are, but you also need to win enough of them to get to winners, right? Like, that's a pretty standard thing you've got to make sure you achieve. And there's just a few moments that make me question that right now. This is kind of absurd as well, even if you look at the entire season. Now, yes, it's obviously not skewed, but the performance this stage doesn't help it. But OpTic are the 5th worst search and destroy team in the league, which is pretty bad, given there are some bad search teams in the league. So they're only better than Boston, that's a given, Vegas, Ravens and Gorillas. Every other team in the league has a better search and destroy record than OpTic do this year, which is, you know, pretty bad. So it did remind me a little bit of this clip that came out back in April now when OpTic were kind of struggling a little bit, and Karma came out on stream and said that, you know, we're not playing to win at times, the laydown cheese doesn't work, was the argument, effectively saying that, like, Pred is maybe not playing the most optimal Call of Duty at the moment. And it feels like he's kind of, I wouldn't say slipped back into those patterns precisely, but there are certainly some echoes in Pred's play over the last couple of weeks of what he was getting heavily criticised for when they weren't as good as they needed to be back in Stage 2. They did fix it, but of course, you know, you can always look at things in hindsight, can't you, and say, well, actually, during Major 3, even the qualifiers, did they look that good? They looked good, but did they look dominant? Not necessarily. They turn up to the tournament in Toronto, and at the start of the tournament, it's not like they're absolutely frying, and obviously they go to the Sunday and they completely fry the opposition and just play an unbelievable level of COD that we have not seen in a rather long time from any team. But, you know, that was one Championship Sunday where they made the crazy losers run. But, you know, going into that Championship Sunday, I didn't have them to win because I'd watched all their games and thought, you know, this team isn't enough. Maybe they can get top 3, but I wasn't really seeing them going further than that. We know what their ceiling is. We have seen it. And it's incredible to me. It's maybe not incredible because it's understandable, but it's like we're only a few weeks after the major, and already I'm seeing lots of discussion on social media about, you know, got to drop Pred, right? Pred's got to go, got to bring HyDra in, or whatever they're saying at the moment. And it's like this is only a few weeks after crowning them, you know, the best team in the world by quite some margin. So it is incredible how quickly things change, but at this point we have to genuinely recognize the scenario. What if OpTic can't turn this around? Because after a couple of losses, the Vegas loss was bad, but, you know, Virginia server cheese, whatever they want to say. The Rocker loss was embarrassing, and if after that they'd have beaten Ravens, they'd have, you know, gone Game 5 with New York and won, or at least if they'd have won a search and destroy, or at least just shown more promise in those search and destroys, then I'd have said, okay, you know, they can kind of reject this downward spiral they're currently in. But the problem is, we have to realistically consider what if they don't, right? What if they can't get out of this? What if they start in losers at Major 4 and they come top 6? I mean, even if they get that far, it's not great, is it? And, you know, this is when FormaL, having tweeted out about, you know, 16 teams at this Esports World Cup, how about potentially returning to the competitive scene for Black Ops 6 next season? I'm not saying it feels more realistic, because I don't really think that it does, but it is at least something to consider that it's not impossible, maybe, on this evidence. Because, I mean, like, how remarkable is this? FaZe are 5-0, but even FaZe, it's not like they've looked indomitable, right? They're beatable. No one's beaten them yet this stage, and maybe they won't. But, you know, they're looking a little bit shakier than they have before, but they're still easily good enough to beat basically everybody. Then Toronto, New York, Surge, Heretics, Legion, like, and Gorillas. These teams are all on 3 wins at least. So OpTic have 1 spot to fight for if they only get 2 wins, right? So if OpTic only get 2 wins, i.e. they beat Boston, they lose to Toronto next weekend, they can get to 2 in 5, and if a number of other results go their way, OpTic, they could potentially still qualify at 2 in 5. Then they'd have to have, like, all the other results, I think, go perfectly for them to do that. And even if they were to qualify at 2 in 5, they would be the 8th seeds playing FaZe round 1, which is probably, well, it depends. Is that what you want? Maybe not, because you've got to play FaZe, a team that your record is 1 in 6 against this season. Or do you want to play FaZe to kind of say, you know what, if we win this series, we can snap out of it and get back into form? Maybe that's true. But, you know, realistically, they're going to need to get 3 series wins to make it to the winners bracket. And to do that, they're going to need to beat Toronto next weekend, which is far easier said than done. So very much interested to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.